Hello everyone, I am Chris Schmidt and I will be tackling a whole bunch of new features in R23 today. A big thank you to everybody watching live and to watching on the internet later, and of course a thank you to Maxon for having me present again. There is a lot to cover, so let's move into Cinema 4D R23. My company, Rocket Lasso, focuses on live streams, tutorials, and plugins, all focused around Cinema 4D and motion graphics. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check out any of those tutorials or the live streams or the plugins, then I would encourage you to go check those out. There is a ton of it, and I tend to get pretty deep and go pretty advanced with a lot of it. However, today we will be focusing on R23 animation tools and scene nodes. Now, there are a lot of features inside of R23, and there is not time to cover all of them. So we will not be talking about the great new UV enhancements, and we will not be talking about the remesher, even though I really love it. I put a poll out on Twitter, and people mostly wanted me to focus on character stuff and the new scene nodes, and that is the plan. One thing I wanted to sneak in, though, is the new magic bullet looks and the screen space reflections. Here's a lovely scene file that you can find in the content browser. If you were not aware, there is a lot of new things included in the object browser, including example scenes covering tons of the new features inside of R23, so I highly recommend checking it out. Now, this scene file, I think, has actually been here for a while. I made a couple tweaks just to make it demo a little bit nicer. But I want to talk about the viewport in Cinema 4D and how much it's improved over time. So some things we've had for a little bit are things like screen space ambient occlusion. Turn that on, and now we get this nice contact shadow everywhere. Next up, something like shadows. Here's a shadow outside the window, and man, that really brings a lot of drama to the scene overall, and being able to see that in the viewport and not in a render, that is just a really great addition that we've had. Next up, let's do some depth of field, which is going to pull the focus onto around the bed. It's subtle here. And in this case, I would like to turn on one more thing, which is reflections. Now, we've had reflections, and what this is going to do is really make all the metals pop all over the entire scene. And if you're doing an entire physically based workflow, like a reflectance workflow, then this will just make everything look amazing. However, it's just reflecting the sky. So if you put an HDR on a sky object, that's what we're seeing. But now there's another setting, and we can see it by, well, first I'm going to turn off depth of field, just so we can see this a little bit better. And under options, go to configure. The shortcut is Shift V. And under configure, if you twirl down the reflections, there is now something called screen space local reflections. Turning this on is going to give us object to object reflections. Now it's pretty subtle. Everything's got Fresnels on it, so we're not going to see it pop too much. However, if I increase the distance a bunch, and zoom around, you can see that this window is reflecting in the floor. This table is reflecting in the floor. Everything is reflecting everything else. You can really see it if I turn it off and on. And you can just see how much more it's placing the objects in the scene when you turn that on. So that is a wonderful little addition. Next up is something I was pretty surprised at, and that is the inclusion of magic bullet looks from Red Giant directly into R23. Hitting Control or Command B will pop open the render settings, and inside here you will see by default in the settings magic bullet looks. Turning on the checkbox for that and clicking the magic bullet looks button will pop open its interface. And here is a completely separate application that will apply post effects on top of your scene, on top of anything that you render. So there is a lot you can do here. Twirling out tools, there are tools for the subject, for the matte object. Let's pull in something. Let's grab a LUT, which is a lookup table. Under matte, we'll do something crazy like star filter. Haven't really used that before. Under lens, chromatic aberration. And you can just keep on adding more and more effects. Twirling this back, you can select any one of those and change the settings. Underneath LUT, select a bunch of different presets or import them from other places. So clicking on that should change the overall color. Clicking on the star filter, which I haven't used, I could pull back the boost. Yeah, make that a little bit more subtle. Change the size so those aren't blowing out too much. Chromatic aberration, separate out our colors. So you can really go nuts here separating out the different color channels, but nice and subtle might be nice. If you don't want to play with those, or if you're not familiar with this piece of software, there are over 200 different presets built in here. So selecting these, we can get nice, subtle different changes, or playing with some other ones, some not so subtle changes. And just by mousing over it, immediately you'll see it get applied, and they just make your scene look completely different. If you want, you can click the nice star in the corner, adding it to your favorites folder, selecting that. I grabbed a whole bunch of high contrast ones just so we can see it. Here's sodium night. Here's a day for night. A nice black and white with heavy contrast. If you like one of these and you tweak it, or if you make your own, you can of course save it as a custom one and save the preset. In this case, I saved this one. And there's nothing subtle about it, but who wants to be subtle in a demo presentation? So let's keep this one, hit the checkbox to essentially apply it, and anything you render, that will get applied to it. But here's where things get really crazy. Oh, I guess one thing to mention is you can pull the slider back to make it a little more subtle. But like I said, why be subtle? Closing that window, you can go into options and turn on magic bullet looks in the viewport. And the crazy thing here is that this works in real time. I can zoom around my camera and with no delay, see that effect applied everywhere. This completely changes the feel of the viewport. It makes me feel like I'm in a different piece of software, and it's just completely changing the way I think about setting up my scenes. So you should definitely check that out. Next up is something about character animation, and it is motion transfer. I've got a character model here, modeled and designed by Jess Herrera. If you are not familiar with Jess, she somewhat recently went freelance, and she is an awesome character designer, modeler, rigger, animator. So if you have any work along those lines, you should definitely contact her. I did not have any new organic characters modeled, and I didn't want to use another one from the content browser because I did that in my original R23 video. So Jess was very generous to allow me to use her character. The plan here is to do the motion transfer, and the easiest way to do that is to rig this character from scratch using the character tool. Let's do that. Character tool right here, clicking on that. We've had this for a while. And inside here, very specifically, we want to go to the Object tab, the Object Properties of Build, and then the template of Mixamo Control Rig. It has to be the Mixamo Control Rig. As soon as you click on that, it'll change the mode. We can click the root and then the pelvis. Holding down control, I can create both arms. Click on hand, go back to the pelvis, hold down control and click on leg, which will create both legs at the same time. And now that we've got all the body parts that this character would have, go to the adjust tab. And now you get all these nice big circles, and those circles are what you should move. You're going to want to start from the center of the character and work your way out. So starting here at the pelvis, I would scoot this down, grab the stomach area, pull that down, the chest, pull that down, this upper chest area, pull that. These are the shoulders, move those into position, move the arm. I don't have time to place all of these perfectly. You just want to make sure that you move each component exactly where you want to. But I've already prepped a file that just moves all these dots everywhere. So I'll jump to that one. Closing this file. Here is exactly that process. I've just moved all the dots to where I want them to go. Having done that, clicking on the character tool, I can move to the next step, which is binding. I want to bind this character to this new rig. Clicking binding, it has a slot to put in all of the objects. I want to lock this so this interface doesn't disappear. Collapse down character, and I want to control all these different components. So I'll select every single piece of the mesh here, drag it into the binding, and there we go. This is now a rigged character. Clicking unlock, selecting the character tool, I can jump into animate, and we are now ready to animate this character. If I were to select this hand control and move it around, you can see this character has now been rigged just from moving those dots around and dragging in the different meshes. If you're going to be doing some character animation, this is the perfect place to stop. You have control over your character, but this is all about the motion transfer. And in order to do that, I would like to make this character object editable. So clicking the letter C while it's selected will explode it into all of its components. It has a bunch of hidden layers. So inside of layers, I'll expose those. And now we get all these different areas inside the rig. So here is a retarget hierarchy. I want to minimize that. Here's the controls. I don't need those. The bind hierarchy, that's what I want. This is what the character is actually bound to. And just FYI, this is the official process from Maxon of the best way to do this. Selecting the bind hierarchy, I'll just pull that entirely out of the character, collapse it for a moment so I can delete everything else. We don't need that. Re-expand the hierarchy, and we've got all these PSR tags, which typically would be important, but they're not doing anything anymore. We deleted everything they were linked to. So selecting all those PSR tags, these constraint tags, I can delete them. And now we've just got a skeleton exactly on the character and already bound and set up. The next step here is to actually start using the motion transfer tool. Right-clicking on the bind hierarchy, going into rigging tags, and finding the character definition tag. Selecting that, will give us a very simple interface. And all I would like to do is open the manager. Pops up on my other screen. Inside here, you can see there's a root and a whole bunch of different categories. We're not going to get too specific yet, but you can see inside of the torso, it's trying to find the hips. It's trying to find the spine. It's trying to find the neck. This rig, this bind hierarchy, is already perfectly set up to work with the system. So without clicking or thinking about this at all I have to do is select our bind hierarchy, click extract skeleton, and immediately you can see 66 joints have been added in, and this is now ready to be transferred. Closing that interface, that is now completely done, and this can be collapsed as well. Selecting the character definition tag, there's another button, create solver, which will just automatically create a handy motion solver tag for us. You can see inside here, there's a source character and our current character, which already has this character definition dragged in. Well, we want to give it a source. And where's that source going to come from? Well, that could come from a lot of different places. It could come from any Mixamo character you might have downloaded from Adobe Mixamo. But inside of Cinema 4D R23 in the content browser, there's a bunch of brand new motion capture. Inside of motion capture, here is a bunch of new motion capture presets captured originally by Maxon. And we can drag any of these in that we want. Specifically, I'm going to grab running jump. Drag that in, and here is a skeleton, a joint rig all set up. And if I hit play, you can see it is running along and it does a nice little jump. So it's working pretty nicely. I'll zoom out a bit to see it. You'll see that all of the motion data coming in from the content browser already has a character definition tag. Meaning, if I click on this character solver tag, all I have to do is drag in that character definition tag as the source, and immediately our new character will jump into this new pose. Rewinding and hitting play, we should see our character running, but she will be running in place. We can fix that really easily by finding out that the motion from here, we've got that skeleton, but the skeleton's kind of running in place. So there's this motion offset, and here you can see that this is where the keyframes are. That is what is moving forward. So that's what we want to tell to move forward. Really easy to do by right-clicking on our bind hierarchy, adding a rigging tag, and a brand new constraint tag, which will take the PSR, the position, scale, and rotation of the motion offset. Just drag that in. That should now be linked for motion as well. Visually, I would like to hide that motion offset. And now hitting play, now our brand new rigged character is running along, getting that motion transfer, and even the hair is staying stuck to the head and traveling along with the entire thing. It is really quick to set this up, and as long as you follow that very specific process, it is trivial to get a character rigged up in the most basic way and then get it animating across the screen. The new Toon rig and Delta MUSH deformer. Here is Jess's character again, and I would like to apply a brand new character rig to it. We can find that under character object. Under the character object, there is now a new template called Toon rig. I have to say, I didn't typically use the Cinema 4D character object very often because I like a lot of very advanced controls in my rigs, so I would typically make it myself. With this rig, we can do the same things, holding down control to create the arm. And now that those arms are selected, I could go into the spine, back to the spine, and create some legs, holding control to get both again. Now that's been created. There's also going back to the spine, we could also create a face rig from this. And you can see there's a lot of different controls here. There's a lot to do to set this up. And I have to say, it's fairly involved. There's a lot of very specific steps, and there's an amazing video set up on Cineversity all about the Toon rig made by Sebastian Pfeiffer, who made the Toon rig. I highly recommend checking that out. It's a must watch, especially for the face rig. Having said that, we can go to the Adjust tab. It's going to look very similar to what we had before. We can move all these components. In fact, as far as the body is concerned, this is a lot more simple than the one we were dealing with earlier. All of it will automatically adapt and be symmetry set up. There's a very specific order to move these, and really the only way to know is to check out that Cineversity video. Maybe there's help files, but I didn't check. So all these different controls can be moved all over the place. I'm going to skip over all that because we don't have time, and you should check out those Cineversity videos because it is very, very detailed and you can get access to this entire rig. Having said that, I can close this file. I went through the same process we went through earlier. moved all the correct pieces to where they need to go. And here is that final character. I've even already applied the binding to the character. So all of the different components have been dragged in. So under the animate tab, this is now set up and ready to go. Just to show off a couple of the cool features in the Toon rig, if I were to grab this arm and start moving it around, I can stretch it immediately. But hitting T for scale, if I'm in the object mode here, not model, but object, I can actually scale up these components and scale the different parts of the rig larger and smaller. You get some really cool scaling on the arm, get some Popeye type things going, scale up every component. It's really bendy, really wiggly. It looks great. And this is just what came out of the box. I didn't do any extra weighting on at least the parts I'm showing you so far. And I can pull this leg up and stretch it, and everything just looks really nice right away. But not everything is perfect when it comes to auto binding. And this has nothing to do with the new Toon rig. It just has to do with cinemas doing the best they can to try and figure out what should be weighted. But you can't automatically get it working all great right out of the box. You'll see that this knee is bending a little bit strangely. As I bend this up, you see it's not looking so hot right there. And then these are actually keyframed. If I pull this in, you see the arms will bend into this new position. I'll turn off the hair so it's not getting in the way. You can see that this weighting's not amazing. It looks a little bit janky around the hand, that these legs and the hips pinch really badly. Now, what I did do is this arm, I spent some time and I repainted the weights very manually. You can see everything's been cleaned up quite a bit. It looks a lot smoother than it was. If we turned on the subdivision surface, it'd probably look all right. It's going to get smooth as it goes around. That's not too bad. Put a few more. So that gets nice and smooth out. Not bad. However, we have a new tool here, and that is the Delta MUSH deformer. Going into the deformers, you can find Delta MUSH. This is a deformer that it can work on other things, but specifically where it's most useful is after a skin deformer. So these arms are calculating and they're getting deformed, and this Delta MUSH can be dropped inside and is going to automatically try and smooth everything out. Now check out the one that I spent a bunch of time smoothing out, and now check out the one that is just the out-of-the-box weighting. This is so much closer to all the weight painting I did, and instead of like I don't know how long I took on this, but the 10 minutes to repaint the weights on that, I'm getting almost exactly the same result from this automatically. Let's copy that same Delta MUSH to the legs. So I'll just make a copy of that and find the mesh pants there, drop it after the skin, and the instant I drop it, check it out. Look at those knees. Look at how this knee has smoothed out. Turning this off and on, it is doing an amazing job of redefining that shape without fixing the weights. If you have a job that you have to do really quick and there's one point that's escaping because it's linked to, let's say the elbow is somehow linked to where the stomach is and it's bending really weird, this will go really, really long way to fixing that right out of the box. I'm actually really impressed with how easy it is to use. Like the default settings that it comes with look really great. You can add a little bit of smoothing if you want to really get that nice and rounded. You get to add additional iterations, but if you push it too far, it can get weird. So the default out of the box 10 looks really nice. A way of thinking about this is like a smart, smooth deformer. It's not just smoothing, it's actually detecting how much these points have moved and what their relative distance to their neighbors were. So there's a lot more intelligence behind it automatically. And man, it can really clean things up. I suggest checking out some of the Maxon examples as well. It is really cool. In fact, there's some inside the content browser, but hey, this is supposed to be new original stuff. So that is the very, very basics of the Toon Mesh and the Delta MUSH. Pose library. I'm actually a lot more excited about this feature than I thought I would be. It is really neat to use, but having said that, it is very specific in the way that you should set it up. Now we're back to Jess's character here. You can see why I wanted to have something neat to look at, because we were going to be working with this character a lot, no matter what it was. So in this case, let's talk about a couple different things. Here is a face rig. It's pretty much the Toon face rig, but I have to say I made a couple of tweaks because I'm very specific in what I like. So I modified the rig a little bit. That's not the point. Whatever the mouth rig you've got set up, and there are characters inside the content browser if you want to just have one to play with, I've got these controls set up. Something to note really quickly is you can make selection objects, and that's very, very handy. So if I were to select a couple of controls here, let's just grab these four. I would want to maybe create a selection object. If you're not familiar, say select, selection filter. I want to create selection object. And now this object right here, if I ever double click on it, it will select those four objects I had selected when it was created. That's very handy to have. I've actually created 2 of those already. One is the lips of this character, which are just these 4 outer controls. I can move that around and change the lips of the character. And then there's mouth. And if I double click on that one, it'll actually be the tongue and the teeth and every single control. Because when we are recording the positions for these mouth shapes, we want every single control. If you accidentally forget one, it can make it very difficult to repair. Anyway, the new features now are under Character, Manager, Pose Library, Browser. Selecting that, it'll open up this interface, which doesn't look like too much right away. For me, there's already 2 things built in because I've already made 2 different sets of mouth controls. We're going to ignore those for now and come back to that later. Selecting preferences, we've got 2 buttons down here that we could currently select. One is Save, don't need that yet. But then there is Create New Library. You cannot record a pose until we've created a new library. In this case, I will rename it Demo. And then with Demo selected, I can now make a folder. This folder is a new group of some sort. I will name it Phonemes. If you are not familiar with the concept of phonemes, they are pretty neat and handy for doing character animation, specifically mouth shapes. So from a Google image search, I just searched for phonemes, and here's a bunch of different images of kind of key mouth shapes to do different sounds, different common sounds. You can see here there's like an O and an E and an Ah, and all these different ones are great reference to go and grab. Although you can't get better than just grabbing a mirror and seeing what shape you make with your mouth at any given sound, and those become phonemes, and it sort of becomes a template that you can jump between to quickly build dialogue from your character. So having said that, why don't we make one right now? We just need to make some sort of mouth pose. So now we've got a library and a folder. We now have the ability to create a pose. Let's make that pose. In fact, before we make that pose, let's make a basic pose. I want this base shape. So having done that, I'll double click my mouth. So everything's selected. You could manually select the things you want, but I have it pre-built there. Clicking that new pose, it will create a new pose, rename it to base. That will create that base shape. Let's make a closed mouth shape. So I'll start by closing this jaw a bit. This is in my overall selection. I'll pull that up as much as I have to get it kind of closed. And then selecting the different controls, scoot this down. I'm not going to aim to be perfect. I'll push that down a bunch, push this up. I think mostly the lower lip is the one that moves, not the upper one, but it's a cartoony character. That can go up, and very meticulously you can move all these controls into all the perfect positions to be able to create that mouth shape. These larger splines are making it a little bit easier for me to select, although it's still not super easy. Pulling those down, there you go, good enough mouth shape. It's kind of like that little cat face. Having done that, I've got a nice new pose. Double click on the mouth. I've got all the current controls. Select to add a new pose. It will add it. You can't add a new pose unless you've got something selected in that folder structure, because otherwise it doesn't know where to put it. Having this new pose, I could just call this, let's just say closed. Closed. And we've now got 2 different mouth shapes. Selecting one, I could click on this little blank image here, and it'll jump to that mouth shape. Selecting closed, clicking that image, it'll jump to that one. Where it starts getting powerful is if I select one of them and drag the slider, it will transition into that new shape. So I don't have to go all the way. I could go a little bit, hit enter, and it'll bake that down as that shape. Having said all of this, I've actually already built out all of the main phonemes that I want to work from. So let's check those out. Selecting here, I actually emptied out these images intentionally. I could select any one of these and select this image and jump to all these different mouth shapes. And we don't have to check them all, but I've pre-built them. Let's, in fact, hide the controls. And you see there's an E shape and a nice huge mouth just for fun. Bunch of different mouth shapes. What I would like to do now, and something I found very handy, is we can create preview images of this. If I were to select, let's say, the Ah, and click this empty image, I can render an image and it'll save it there. Now, if you're doing that while you're working on a character, they tend to get out of sync, like your camera position changes. You have to remember to hide the controls so they're not in the way. So what I've been finding is I don't worry about rendering the images until I've got all the shapes that I want. And now that I have the shapes I want, let me frame up the character a little bit better. In fact, the craziest one is the huge mouth. So I'll frame that up a bit, get nice and close because it's going to eat up all the space. And now we can start saving the images. So clicking on the Ah, let's go to that image, this pose, clicking on the image, and then render it. Jump to the next one. Click on the image to set the pose, render it. And now very quickly, I can render out the image of each one of those and create previews so that we don't need to base it off of the text, but just off the visual, which is always handy. Only 3 more. Very, very quick to jump through all these phonemes. And there we go. So those are now all saved. Something to notice is that these are not currently saved yet. These are all saved locally to your computer, not in this scene file. If you send this scene file to someone else, they will not have these poses. So in addition to that, you can see right now that these are highlighted because they are not saved yet. So you have to make sure to hit the save button, and now those are saved. Having said all that, let's go ahead and select this folder and then click the thumbnail view. And this will now pop open a preview of everything we just rendered. We don't need the library anymore. And very quickly, with my single monitor here, I'll have to scale this down a bit. I can just click on any one of these images and jump to that mouth shape. And it starts getting really fun. And you can see how these are all from the same POV. So it's very handy to see it that way. I can drag in a mouse shape, just a small proportion. Like we can take the shape and start closing it a bit and hit enter to bake it in. And then start dragging in another pose, hit enter to bake it in proportionally, and drag in any of these shapes, whichever amount we want, and hit enter, or just click the image to get 100% and hit enter to bake it in. Keep in mind, you have to hit enter. It tripped me up in the beginning that I'd drag a slider and be like, oh, I want some of this mouth shape, and watch, it's going to pop. When I click on, let's say, this S sound, as soon as I click the slider, it's going to suddenly pop. And that's because I didn't hit enter to bake it in. So now I can drag this in, hit enter, and then start pulling in the ah a little bit and bake that in. So you can imagine combining this with those auto keyframes, picking new poses, changing a time, picking a new pose, changing a time. And then something I would highly recommend is, as useful as this is, you don't want to just stay with these poses. If I were to say jump to this mouse shape, hit enter, I would probably want to unhide my controls and then make this not perfectly symmetrical, move this off to the side a little bit, make sure that I'm doing in between frames so that the mouth moves in nice directions. And you can really customize everything and make it your own, but very rapidly get the basic shapes built in. And I think that's going to be the best use of this tool. Having said all that, I did just create a very simple animation here. I can scrub this through. So you can see I get this mouse shape going. I tried to get some nice overlaps going on everything, making sure everything was kind of flowing in nice big arcs. So just going very quickly, going through some of those key mouth poses and additional ones to really control the way that that lays out. Maxon was gracious enough to give me the opportunity to show off Rocket Lasso's very first plugin, Recall. Now, we're hard at work on some new plugins, but this one that we released not too long ago is all about saving the current state of your object and being able to bring it back again later. I've got a nice simple scene file here, a couple objects from the content browser, but specifically I've made this bottle. It's very simple. It's a loft. It's got a material, some end sides, some stars. If I hit NB, you can see there's a bevel sharpening up some of these edges. That's all good. I'm going to make some changes to this that's maybe a little bit destructive. So how about right-clicking on the bottle and adding a recall tag? This is the plugin from Rocket Lasso. By creating that and double-clicking on it, I have stored the current state of this object as it is now. So if I were to do something like select the loft, make it editable, go to polygon mode, select some of those polygons, let's do a loop selection, maybe grab a couple of stripes from it, D for extrude, extrude it, and be like, okay, that's cool. I like the look of that. I want that. And then I keep on going and working on the scene file, and I make some changes over here, and I do some changes over there. And then a half hour later, I'm like, you know what? I don't like this bottle that much. I want to make some changes I want to go back to what it was, but I made it editable. Well, because I stored it with recall, all I have to do is double click on the recall tag, and it will bring it back to the state when we stored it. But things can get so much more interesting than that. Let's keep on making more changes. This loft, let's duplicate it. So I got a second loft, and I just want one of these end sides. So pulling that up into the air, T for scale, make it bigger, duplicate that end side, pull it up into the air. Easy now. T for scale, make it a little bit bigger there. Too many subdivisions, so I'll pull that way back down and add a cork material there. So now I've got a cork on the top of this bottle. Let's say I want to hold on to that. So making a second recall tag by right-clicking and making a recall, or duplicating the current one, I can hold down Control or Command and double-click. It will change color, which means I have now made a new state. I now have two different states stored. Double clicking on the first tag will jump me back to this one. Double clicking on the second will bring back the cork. Having done this, let's make some more changes. Selecting the star, I can hit T for scale and scale up that shape. Select this top one, T for scale, make that one a little bit bigger. There we go, a very different shape. Even change the shape of the cork, T for scale, pull that down a bit. Okay, excellent. And how about we change the hierarchy a bunch in addition to the cork? Let's create a bend, or actually, let's make a twist deformer. Yeah, twist deformer. Put that after the bevel and click Fit to Parent. Something we didn't get a chance to talk about is also in R23 is this new interface where we can see the direction of the twist in addition to the direction that it's going to twist. So cranking this up, we can see it will spin around the orientation on Y and in that direction. Very, very handy. A bunch of the deformers now have that interface, which is pretty neat. Now that's nice and twisted, create a smoothing deformer. Drop that after the twist. Oh, and another thing, look at this nice highlighting that we're getting now in R23 so that you can tell exactly where we're going to be placing something. So this is now smoothing. I want to stiffen it up a bunch because I only want a little bit of smoothing. Hit NA so we can see the final. And so there we go. There's a nice third bottle. Create another copy of a recall tag, holding down Control Command, double click, and now I've got a third copy. I can now jump between these different states of it and make any shape that I want. If I were so inclined, I could go back to this center one and make a quick change to the model here. Let's pinch this in smaller. Well, I kind of like that. Nice and simple. And I'll override that one. So now that one's gone and I've overridden it by holding down Control Command, double clicking. And now I can jump between those different ones. But things get a lot more interesting when we can make a duplicate of this bottle, copy and pasting it, scoot one off to the side. Now I've got duplicates of this tag, which means that one could become one of the other states of the bottle. These tags actually are storing the same information, so there's no replication. You can make unlimited copies here, and it's not making your scene file any bigger as far as what the tags are storing. As long as it's stored once, then it's stored on all of them. Delete the copy. I don't need that one again. Here's something that's kind of cool. Creating a new object, let's say a figure. T for scale, just to make it a little more reasonable. I could scoot this into some other position, even rotate it to some different angle. This will look weird, but let's tilt it forward and then copy one of my recall tags onto that. Let's copy this one on and say, okay, double click. That object, the figure, has now turned into a bottle, and this has taken on its position and its scale and its rotation, and now it's there in space. It can get even more interesting. I don't need that one, so I'll delete it. I've got what used to be a cloner, but it was made editable. So I've got all these randomly rotated cubes that are in all these different orientations. Well, if I were to take my recall tag and copy it onto each of these objects, very simply, I could select all of those tags and say, okay, recall. And every single one of those has now become a copy of the bottle. So there are a lot of really fun things you can do with recall, and this is a very, very basic demo of it. I've got longer demos of recall, which I would love for you to check out, but I'll just sneak one more thing in here, and that is the ability to combine recall with a camera inside of Cinema, because this is where it just is so useful on a day-to-day workflow. Creating a camera, how often does this happen to you? Where you create a camera and you're like, okay, cool, here's my camera angle, this is what the client wants, so there's the bottle and a bunch of other ones in the background, and that's exactly right there where it should be. And you're like, okay, cool, that's my position. And then you're working and you're doing some things, you have to make a change to a bottle, and then you're like, okay, well, let me make a fix over here, do this and do this. And then you're like, oh no, I moved my camera, and you try and jump back to it. So I'm hitting undo view, undo view, undo view. It's like, was it here? Was it here? Was it here? Was it here? Which one of those was it? And then you just don't know. Now there's other things you could do, like record some keyframes on it or put a protection tag on it so it can't rotate. But that stops you from moving around. It'll constantly jump back to that position. If I were to find the position I like here, I could just add a recall tag to it. Double clicking on the recall tag, it has now stored everything about that camera, which means I am free to move around, refocus, model something, change whatever I like, and at any given moment be like, okay, cool, go back to when I stored the camera. So just double clicking that tag, I jump back to this position. Having done that, let's say there's a couple different shots. I could choose a new framing, pull this down. Let's even zoom out a bit and then frame up this way, create a duplicate of this recall tag, hold down Control to override it. And now I've got two different states. Let's go even crazier though, and create a keyframe animation of this. So let's go to a top view and record the position and rotation. At the time of 0, record these keyframes. Fast forward to the end of these 90 frames and pull this down and focus, let's say right around there. And record that position. Now this has keyframes. So let's create another recall tag, creating a copy, overriding that one. I can now jump between the state of all three of these. So this is a camera with keyframes. But if I double click on the first recall tag, you'll see that not only do we go back to that first original position, but there's no keyframes on this. This is not a camera with keyframes because that's not the state when that was stored. Let's go to the second camera position. Double clicking, there's the second one, still no keyframes. Double clicking the third one, that's the one that had keyframes. So double clicking, I can now hit play, and now the animation is back. Clicking on the camera, there are the keyframes. So you can see how you can store all this different information on these tags, and just by double clicking, storing it, and double clicking again and bringing it back. There are so many more things it can do, but we have more R23 to talk about. So let's jump back into the last huge new feature to talk about, and that is scene nodes. Now, this is a tech preview from Maxon. This is not fully featured yet. It's sort of an experiment. They put it out ahead of time because they want to get feedback from users. Nodes are inherently kind of complicated. It's a very sophisticated process, and this is the very beginnings of it, and they need feedback. Now, having said that, let's jump into another scene file. I've prepared a couple of lights and a couple of materials. I want to explain the concept before we get into the nodes. Creating a plane and making it editable. If I were to select polygon mode and hit the letter D for extrude, if I have nothing selected and I drag, everything will extrude. In Cinema, if nothing is selected, then it's kind of like everything is selected. Also keep in mind that if I select everything, Control or Command A, and drag, then it will extrude everything. Now, it's only when some polygons are selected that they specifically get extruded. So keep this technique in mind as we move into the nodes. Deleting this object, I want to change my layout so we can actually see the nodes. So layout, nodes, jumps to the other monitor, here it is. And we won't really see much because first you have to click this Scene Nodes button. And now we can actually interact with the Scene Nodes interface. Maxon put most of their focus when it comes to scene nodes into two main areas. The main one is actually motion graphics tools, things like the cloner and fields and fall-offs. That's where a lot of the focus ends up going. However, last second, they snuck in a bunch of additional tools in the world of modeling nodes. So even though a lot of the effort and focus was put into the MoGraph nodes, I actually find the modeling nodes way more appealing because we can already do tons of MoGraph stuff. But as far as doing parametric modeling, that's a little bit trickier. So I think that's where we will spend our focus. And specifically, let's try and do a node-based city generator. It won't get too crazy, but I think it's something that can be a little bit more advanced, and we can definitely go deeper and deeper and deeper into it if we were so inclined. Here is our overall interface. There is a lot of categories. There are so many different things that can be overwhelming. Large categories of things, but we're going to try and step through this in a simple way, but we don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail, so we'll just keep on plowing ahead. To begin with, there's probably a lot of ways to start generating a city, but I believe a good way to start is with a plane. You can find that under geometry, but specifically, I'll just search for it. Just type into the asset search bar the word plane, and we can find a geometry plane. This contains just the points and polygon information that make up a plane, as well as the settings for it. But it's not a real object. It's not a real object until we feed it into a geometry node. By searching for that, I can find a geometry operator. By pulling this out, it can be fed a bit of geometry, specifically from the plane here, and that can be output into the scene. And now it's become real in the viewport. Hitting NB, we can see the individual polygons, and it's behaving just like a regular plane would. Although notice that it does not exist in the object manager, it is only through the nodes. Next up, we need to start modifying this somehow. We want roads, and a good way to do that is with an inset. An inset is just like a inner extrude. So dragging this onto this wire, it'll actually interject it into this stream and inset every single one of these polygons. But right now it's super huge. Changing the inset to 1 unit, we can now see that we're getting what we might be able to use as roads. That's actually working quite nicely. Next up, we should extrude upward from this inset to create our buildings. With that, we want an extrude. Searching for extrude under geometry, there's extrude. Interject that one onto this wire and zoom out a bit, and well, it extruded, but not quite the way we want to. And if I rotate down, we can see that what's happened is every single polygon has extruded. But why would that be? Well, remember what we were talking about with a plane? If nothing is selected, it's as if everything is selected. So let's actually set an active selection on this plane. Scooting it over so we have a little extra room, I'll search for the word select. Here, I want an active selection. So what will be the active selection? Well, this geometry wants an active selection. And what will that active selection be made of? Well, it wants some indices or the indexes of some polygons. We can get that through a selection range. The geometry will be fed in. This selection range is going to select all polygons. It's outputting an array of indexes, which can be fed into the indices. And this is now selecting all of the polygons. But nothing counts when it comes to nodes until it's put into the stream. And this is the final output. So if it's not linked to something that gets to the final output, it doesn't count. So this geometry now becomes our basis. And the instant I connect it, we can now see that we're getting our individual extrudes because everything was selected. And then that selection was inset. And then only those inner ones were selected. And now that's what gets extruded. If I select our polygon mode here and select one of our nodes, we can actually see the active selection in the viewport, which is actually pretty handy. So with all of these getting inset, we can quickly see the most basic possible city generator by turning on, let's say, proportional, doing a lot of proportional inset with lots of variation, grabbing the extrude and doing a bunch of offset with lots of variation. And there we go, the most basic possible city generator. But obviously, we want to go way further than that. So no offset variation, no offset at all for the extrude. And on the inset, let's get rid of all that variation, go back to not proportional, but an absolute value of 1 to give us these roads. Let's make a sidewalk for ourselves. That can be simple by doing a quick offset of, let's say, 0.5. Yeah, that's pretty small, maybe a bit big in the end. And then do an inset of, I'm not sure what, so we'll drag in a copy of our other inset, feed in the geometry, output that geometry, and there we go. It is now doing a second inset right there. So now we have a road and then a sidewalk. This should probably be smaller, maybe 0.5. This upward movement, make it a little smaller, 0.2 perhaps. So just that little offset. So we have a road and these individual plots of land. My thought is let's separate these out into separate objects, not only so it's easier to work with, but also so we can apply different materials. Saving this scene file, just in case, I want to split this off into 2 separate pieces. Now, this extrude is, actually, it's after this inset. This inset is what we want to separate out. So from the inset, let's delete things. Search for the word delete, and under geometry, here's a delete. So cool. Interject this, and it is deleting the active selection. So that would be that plot of land in between each road. So that's actually fine. That's exactly what we want. How about getting a material onto this road? That's pretty straightforward as well. Searching for the word material. There's a material operator that we can drag in after the geometry operation. So that's just the order that those have to be in. When it comes to a lot of these nodes, it's just like Espresso. You're going to have to spend some time memorizing what the individual nodes do and how they combine. I'm trying to show you a pretty advanced usage of this, but it doesn't get too complex. It's a bunch of relatively simple ideas all layered on top of each other, and it took me a bit of time to get to this point. In any case, we now have this material operator, and it looks exactly like a texture tag, a material tag we'd put on an object. So if these are the roads, let's drag in this road material, and instantly that gets textured. Here's where things get interesting. We only have road geometry now. The plots of land are gone, but these are nodes, which means at any step of the way, we can branch out and do something separate. Keep in mind, at the stage of this inset, we have the plot of land still there, and it's actively selected. So what if we invert that selection? Searching for the word select, I could drag in an invert selection. If that gets inverted, and then we delete it, and then we turn it into real geometry and then apply a material, we should get the plots of land. So grabbing all 3 of these, holding Control or Command to make a duplicate of them, I can link the invert selection in, which then gets deleted, which then creates geometry, which then has a material, which should be the grass here, dragging this grass material, and output that into the scene. There we go. Look at that. No more roads, but now we have plots of land that are the grass. So that's working really well, except we can only output one thing at a time. So these need to get combined somehow. How can we combine that? Well, let's search for the word children. And under the operators, there is a children operator. Dragging that in, what I do is I think of this sort of like a null, and this wants to be fed children. So if we feed it the first object we're outputting and the second object we're outputting, this is now outputting a single thing, essentially a null and its children. So let me click that a little bit better. And there we go. Now a road with the road material and these lots with the grass material applied, working quite nicely. Next up, let's do a quick inset on the grass so that we can get a little bit of grass around every building. After we delete, we are left with the plots of land. So how about sticking an inset in there? Steal a copy of this inset, drag the geometry in, output that as this geometry, and we should see a new inset on top of everything, which is fine, but because we inverted our selection, nothing is selected. And that can get a little bit dangerous, especially if we go to delete something. So even though we're doing this inset, I think before this inset, we should select all of our geometry again. We needed some more space, so this will scoot over. And we need to do that same setup of a select, search for that. I want a selection range, which will take all the living geometry, select all of the polygons, and then make the active selection from that. So this geometry has a selection. This is updating what is selected, and that output will now go to the inset. And by doing this combination of things, we can now see that that is indeed selected. So this inset, I think it can go pretty far, let's say 2, and lots of variation. And this one potentially could be proportional. So this could be I don't know, 25% with like maximum variation. So some are larger, some are smaller, and now we get these different plots of land. This is a good opportunity to split this into 2 objects again. So let's copy what we already did, which is this delete, and let's pull a copy of that up. So after we do this inset, I want to split this from grass into the plots of land for the building. So delete the inside selection, and then if we're deleting the inside selection, what's left is the grass. So this should be not road, but grass, and that will get output. And then we want the opposite of it, which is the same as doing this inversion. So let's select this inversion, delete, reselect all. And I think we can copy all of those. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Copy all of those. And from this step, we're taking that inset, inverting the selection, and then deleting from there, and then eventually reselecting all of them. And that will now be the plot of land that is the inside, which will be building. So this material I'll turn into the building material. Let's relink everything up properly. So that becomes that final output. And that's being made a child here, but we're missing the plots of grass in between. And that is because this is not linked up. The child operator does not have another input for one, but by selecting the node, we could say add input. And now this can be fed through, given a third child, and now we have a separate plot of land. So now we've just got this one set of nodes which are generating essentially concrete for us. I'll move it up because it's kind of like we keep on going further up. It's just my visual organization. So after everything gets selected again, because that's the way we built it, I think it should be, well, let's see, what do we want to do? How about getting more detail by subdividing this? Searching for the word subdivide. There we go. Geometry subdivide. I can drag that in between, and all of those polygons, because it's selecting everything, are getting selected. Exactly what I was hoping for. So it looks good. However, well, there's still an active selection. Everything is selected. So that is good, because what I'd like to do is another subdivision. But this one, I don't want to apply to everything. I want to apply randomly. So searching for the word select, there's a really cool node of random selection. So it's going to, I believe, select from only the things that are currently selected. So if I select this subdivide, you can see everything is selected, all the subdivisions. So feeding this into the random selection. And if I were to take that geometry and output it, hopefully we can see, let's see. I guess it's not going to show it until we do something to it. So this is creating a random selection of points. Oh, there we go. If we change this to polygons, now you can see that different polygons are randomly selected, and we can choose the percentage chance that those are caught, which is excellent because now I'll copy the subdivide a second time, feed in that random selection into it, and now, hopefully, once we feed this into our overall stream here, now some of these, anything that was selected, is subdivided again, giving us a lot more detail overall. Awesome. So one of the last steps here is let's reselect everything. I want everything selected. So here is the select everything 2 nodes. Copying those over. We can take this after we subdivide. I want to select from that geometry everything, so that gets fed into both places, just like we've been doing. And so now everything is selected. After that, that's when we do our extrude. So search for extrude, drop it in, feed out our selected all everything, output that as our final geometry, and let's see what we get. Oh, look at this. Everything is getting selected and everything is getting extruded. So after we select all, let's randomly select some of these polygons. So copying this random selection over again, holding Control or Command, feed in all of the geometry. That gets output into the extrude. So it's not everything. It is now 50% of the polygons of the active selection. So it's 50% of everything. And we can now see 50% of the polygons are getting extruded out to be these buildings. We could increase this amount and have more. We could decrease it and have less. And everything that's not extruded is kind of like these parking lot, like concrete slabs. I think something a little higher would be nice. And, well, let's check out something. If I go and look under this building, we'll see that it's not quite behaving the way we want to. Every polygon is individually getting extruded. That's not what we want. But if we select the extrude, there's an amazing checkbox in here. Under polygons is use islands. Turning on use islands will combine all of those and do a single extrude on each one, which will clean up a lot of geometry, and we don't have intersecting polygons then. And with all those grouped up, adding offset variation will give us a bunch of different heights on all of our buildings. Going to object mode, so I can hit NA and just see our final geometry. We are now getting a pretty respectable randomly generated city. And at any point, we could go to any of our previous nodes and modify them to get an overall different look. The biggest change we'll see here is going to this random selection and changing the seed, and different buildings are being selected to grow. And there's just so much power here for how deep we can go on it. Now, that is as far as I can go with the time that we have. Saving that, I can close this scene file, and here is the exact same setup we were just working from, except I've modified the beginning a little bit. So currently I'm just outputting the original plane. It's currently 5x5 subdivisions because I am taking a random selection of those polygons and subdividing them, which gives us this result. And then randomly grabbing a selection of those and subdividing again, which gives me this output, which is random again. Finally, scoot this over so I can show you that final output. I am removing all of the n-gons, subdividing one more time, which is giving us this overall smooth bit of geometry. And that becomes the basis to grow a new city. By feeding that into the original inset, this is where we generated the original road. So all I've done is sneak in these new nodes right there to change the plane. This can all get output through the entire system that we already just built, identical to what we were just talking about. And if I grab this final combination of children and output it, then it'll generate a city again. And this time it's on these curvy random roads. So we're not on a perfect grid. All the other rules we built in are still applying, but I was able to change that base geometry and get something very different very quickly. Now, I would love to continue and go deeper and deeper on this. I'm not even sure of certain things I want to do. It would be great to figure out like a nice downtown area, have more control over buildings, get multiple levels extruding so that everything's not flat on the top. We could put different detail on different roofs all over the place. It'd be great to randomize colors on there. These are things I'd like to figure out, and I don't even necessarily know how to do that quite yet. But I do believe that this has to wrap it up because we are out of time. So let me go back to my standard layout. So if you liked this tutorial and you would like to see more, I've got a whole bunch of videos. In fact, through my live streams, I've got hundreds of hours of videos on my Rocket Lasso YouTube channel. So head on over to youtube.com/Rocket Lasso, or you can follow @Rocket Lasso on all the different platforms and you'll find me there. I hope you are as excited for the new features in R23 as I am. There is so much, and I did not get to cover all of it. As I said, I have a YouTube video covering all the new features. It's twice as long as this, and it's covering the new UV workflow and the remesher and a bunch of other little things I did not get to in this. I'm very excited for it. Now, I do a lot of live streams. I do tons of tutorials on YouTube. And of course, there's that new plugin. So if you'd like to support the type of stuff that I do, then the best way to do that would be go check out that new Recall plugin. Not only does it help support Rocket Lasso and everything that I'm doing, but it can also help speed up your workflow. That will wrap this one up. Thank you so much again, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.